but I'm a really kind of in the moment kind of person.
Sure.
And I always, being an actress, you move from thing.
The story begins not with fame or loss, but with a memory shaped by discomfort and excitement. One that quietly reveals the temperament of Melissa Sue Anderson long before the world began asking questions about her life, as she once recalled working in Stockton, California during a winter that seemed determined to soak everything it touched, where rain fell endlessly, cold settled into bones, and a massive equipment truck sank helplessly into the mud up to its axles, turning an already demanding production into a test of endurance. And yet, despite the chill, the delays, and the physical strain, what lingered most strongly was not misery, but exhilaration, the feeling that something meaningful was happening, that the shared effort, the challenge, and the sense of purpose made every hardship worthwhile. And this balance between difficulty and quiet resolve would come to define her life, a pattern in which external conditions were rarely gentle, but inner discipline carried her through, not with loud resilience or dramatic declarations, but with a steady acceptance that meaningful work and meaningful living often require discomfort, patience, and an ability to endure without complaint. Marriage as a turning point. When Melissa Sue Anderson married television writer and producer Michael Sloan on March 17, 1990, the choice marked not a romantic headline moment, but a deliberate pivot away from a life she had already found emotionally costly, as by that time she had spent years navigating the pressures of early fame, professional expectations, and the quiet isolation that often accompanies success achieved too young. And rather than seeking excitement, validation, or status, she was seeking something far more grounding: stability, routine, and emotional safety. Qualities that Michael embodied through his work behind the scenes and his distance from the more performative aspects of Hollywood culture. And their relationship developed without spectacle, free from carefully curated narratives or public courtship, built instead on mutual respect and shared values. And after their marriage, Melissa gradually stepped further away from acting, not as an act of rebellion or retreat, but as a conscious realignment of priorities, allowing her marriage to become the emotional anchor around which her adult life would be organized. A partnership that endured quietly for decades, defined less by ambition and more by consistency. Building a life beyond the spotlight. In the years following her marriage, Melissa Sue Anderson made a series of choices that quietly but firmly redirected the course of her life, not away from meaning, but toward a different kind of fulfillment, as she and Michael Sloan focused less on maintaining visibility and more on building a stable family life rooted in presence, routine, and emotional safety, welcoming their daughter Piper in the early 1990s and later their son Griffin in 1996. And with motherhood came a deepening clarity about what truly mattered to her, shaped by her own childhood experiences of early exposure and constant expectation, leading her to create a home environment deliberately removed from the pressures of recognition and performance, where her children could grow without being defined by her past fame. And this withdrawal from Hollywood was neither dramatic nor reactionary, but unfolded gradually through countless small decisions that prioritize emotional health over professional momentum, choosing fewer roles, declining invitations, and allowing distance to replace obligation, until the family's relocation to Montreal, Canada in 2002 became a natural extension of that philosophy, motivated not by crisis or career necessity, but by a desire for balance, privacy, and anonymity. And when Melissa later became a Canadian citizen in 2007, the moment symbolized more than a legal change, marking a second beginning in which she was no longer primarily framed as a former child star managing public memory, but as a wife and mother living a life shaped by routine, faith, and stability, where fulfillment was found not in applause or relevance, but in the quiet consistency of everyday moments, school schedules, shared meals, and a sense of belonging that did not depend on recognition. A quiet marriage, a lasting bond. For more than 3 decades, Melissa Sue Anderson and Michael Sloan sustained a marriage that existed largely outside the narratives typically associated with Hollywood relationships, not because it lacked depth or complexity, but because it was intentionally protected from public interpretation as they navigated parenthood, careers, and personal growth without inviting commentary or validation. allowing their partnership to be defined internally rather than shaped by expectation. And Michael's support of Melissa's limited professional appearances reflected not control or sacrifice, but mutual understanding, as he respected her need for privacy while encouraging her continued connection to storytelling on her own terms, free from pressure or performance, and together they built a life defined by intention rather than ambition, measuring success not by visibility or output, but by balance, emotional steadiness, and shared values. And as their children grew into adulthood and the daily structure of parenting naturally evolved, the partnership remained central, continuing to provide the emotional anchor around which Melissa's world revolved. And this quiet endurance stood in contrast to the more volatile or performative relationships often highlighted within the industry, offering a different model of longevity, one rooted in consistency, mutual respect, and the understanding that love does not require constant affirmation to remain strong, but deepens through years of shared routine, private challenges, and a commitment to living deliberately beyond the spotlight. Widowhood and the weight of silence. In August 2025, the steady rhythm of that long-established life was disrupted by loss, as Michael Sloan passed away at the age of 78, bringing an end to a marriage that had shaped more than 35 years of Melissa Sue Anderson's adult life. And the announcement came without ceremony or elaboration, reported simply through industry channels that identified her as his wife, with no public statements, tributes, or details about the cause, reflecting the way they had chosen to live together, privately and without spectacle. And for Melissa, now in her early 60s, the loss carried a depth that extended beyond grief alone, as it removed the central figure around whom her daily life, emotional stability, and long-term sense of direction had been organized, arriving at a moment when her children were grown and the familiar rhythms of caregiving had already shifted. And unlike earlier losses she had experienced, this one unfolded in near total privacy, without professional obligations, public distractions, or external frameworks to guide or soften the process, allowing grief to settle fully and quietly into her days, reshaping her sense of future and identity in ways that resisted easy language or resolution. And yet, even within that silence, her response remained consistent with the life she had built, marked by restraint rather than dramatization, endurance rather than reinvention, as she continued forward, grounded in faith, routine, and the quiet strength of having lived a life defined not by constant visibility, but by intentional presence and deeply held connection. Grief shared, not performed. The loss of Michael Sloan reshaped Melissa Sue Anderson's life in ways that were deeply personal and deliberately quiet, extending naturally to their children, Piper and Griffin, who, though adults, found themselves navigating a changed family dynamic without the familiar center that had long held them together. And grief became something shared within a small, intimate circle rather than processed through public rituals or statements, as Melissa, no longer buffered by long partnership, adjusted to carrying both emotional weight and practical responsibility in a more exposed way. And later in 2025, when she appeared in a handful of carefully chosen interviews and online discussions, her tone reflected the same restraint that had defined much of her adult life, acknowledging loss plainly, without dramatization or narrative framing, speaking of disorientation and finality rather than transformation or redemption, and faith, particularly the Roman Catholic structure that had shaped her childhood, re-emerged not as an answer to grief, but as a steady framework that offered continuity when language felt insufficient, providing rhythm and grounding rather than resolution. And while daily life in Canada continued, the privacy she had once sought for peace now carried an undertone of loneliness, a quieter house and longer silences that required endurance rather than escape. Yet, even then, she did not return to Hollywood or seek reinvention, choosing instead to remain where she was, rooted in familiarity and routine, continuing the same approach that had guided her through earlier transitions, one defined by steadiness, acceptance, and the belief that some losses are not meant to be reshaped into public meaning, but simply lived with, day by day, in honesty and restraint. Childhood interrupted. Early. To fully understand the depth of this later loss, it helps to look back to the earliest fractures in Melissa Sue Anderson's life, which began long before widowhood or public retreat, as she was born on September 26, 1962 in Berkeley, California, the younger of two daughters in what initially appeared to be a stable middle-class household. And during her early childhood, there were no outward signs of upheaval or instability. Yet, as she entered elementary school, the focus of family life began to shift subtly but decisively toward her appearance, discipline, and ability to meet expectations, as acting. Opportunities emerged and gradually transformed childhood into something more structured and conditional. And when the family relocated from Berkeley to Los Angeles to support her career, familiar anchors such as neighborhood routines, school friendships, and extended family were left behind, replaced by schedules, auditions, and environments where approval was closely tied to performance. And by the time her parents divorced in 1975, when she was just 13 years old, Melissa was already navigating adult responsibilities, absorbing the separation quietly while continuing to work, learning early that personal disruption did not pause professional obligation, and that resilience was often expected rather than nurtured. A lesson that did not break her path forward, but reshaped how she understood safety, attachment, and emotional expression, establishing a pattern in which adaptation became instinctive and vulnerability learned to remain contained. Learning self-containment. After her parents' divorce, Melissa and her sister remained with their mother, while their father's absence became part of daily life rather than something openly processed or explained, and structure replaced reassurance, with Roman Catholic routine offering order and predictability rather than emotional release, and at an age when most children rely heavily on family stability to make sense of change, Melissa learned self-containment, absorbing uncertainty internally and moving forward without asking for reassurance or accommodation, a pattern that would later influence how she approached relationships, work, and fame itself. And this early lesson did not derail her career or produce visible rebellion, but instead reshaped her inner life, teaching her to function independently within systems that required composure and reliability. And over time, this translated into a recurring dynamic where success coexisted with emotional distance, not as a dramatic wound or public struggle, but as a quiet undercurrent that followed her into adolescence and adulthood, shaping her preference for privacy, her comfort with solitude, and her resistance to environments that demanded constant emotional exposure. And while this self-containment provided strength and adaptability, it also narrowed the spaces in which she felt fully understood, reinforcing a lifelong tendency to value stability over visibility and depth over approval. Growing up on Little House on the Prairie. When Melissa Sue Anderson joined Little House on the Prairie in 1974 at the age of 11, she entered a professional environment that would shape not only her career, but her emotional development, as the series followed her through some of the most formative years of her life, demanding maturity, discipline, and emotional restraint well beyond her age, and her portrayal of Mary Ingalls placed her inside storylines that dealt heavily with loss, disability, and grief, including blindness and miscarriage, themes that required sustained immersion in sorrow while she herself was still growing and forming her own sense of self. And while the work earned critical recognition and deep audience connection, including awards, attention, and professional praise, the emotional weight accumulated quietly without structured support or language for burnout, and relationships on set did not consistently offer the sense of belonging one might expect, as differences in age, temperament, and experience created distance rather than closeness, leaving Melissa surrounded by people yet often feeling alone. And over time, the demands of performing restraint and grief blurred into her personal life, reinforcing patterns she had already learned. And when she eventually stepped away from the series, it was not an act of rejection or conflict, but an acknowledgement of limits, a recognition that emotional endurance has boundaries and that stepping back can sometimes be the most honest response to prolonged exposure, a lesson that would echo throughout the rest of her life, guiding her toward quieter choices and a more protected sense of self. Distance without drama. Over time, narratives emerged around her reserved nature, particularly in relation to co-stars, but rather than engaging in public dispute or correction, Melissa remained silent, neither confirming nor contesting others' perceptions. And this silence allowed speculation to grow while also protecting her from ongoing conflict. And years later, when she and Melissa Gilbert acknowledged a modest reconciliation, it did not erase the past but gently acknowledged it, offering closure rather than revision. And the broader environment on set, marked by creative tensions and shifting power dynamics, further reinforced Melissa's instinct to remain neutral and contained, avoiding alignment that might deepen conflict, and while this approach preserved professionalism, it also intensified her sense of separation, teaching her that emotional distance could function as self-protection, burnout without language. As the series progressed, the demands of portraying Mary's blindness required constant physical and emotional restraint, blurring the line between role and reality. And by the time Melissa left the series in its 7th season, her decision was not driven by anger or ambition, but by exhaustion, at a time when emotional burnout was rarely discussed openly, and stepping away meant reduced visibility and a slowing of career momentum. Yet it also marked an early assertion of boundaries as she continued working selectively while declining prolonged exposure, and fans noticed her absence, often interpreting it through speculation rather than understanding. Yet her choices followed a consistent internal logic, prioritizing stability over recognition. Michael Landon as a father figure. Among the few relationships in Hollywood that provided genuine emotional safety for Melissa Sue Anderson was her bond with Michael Landon, who served as mentor, protector, and in many ways a second father, offering guidance without public display and trust without demand. And their collaboration extended beyond Little House on the Prairie, reflecting mutual respect and personal connection. And when Melissa later worked as an associate producer on one of Landon's final projects, it symbolized a transition from child performer to collaborator, suggesting a future in which storytelling could continue without emotional exposure. Loss. That closed a chapter. Michael Landon's death in 1991 from pancreatic cancer was devastating for Melissa, arriving at a moment when she had just begun married life and was already preparing to step further away from acting, and losing him removed the last emotional tie that had made Hollywood feel human and safe. And after this loss, her withdrawal from the industry became decisive, not as a reaction to grief alone, but as a clarification of priorities, as family replaced ambition and privacy replaced visibility. And the irony was not lost that she had spent years portraying loss on screen only to experience it fully in life, without script or audience. Choosing continuity over reinvention. The life that followed was marked not by disappearance, but by continuity, as Melissa Sue Anderson built a private existence defined by routine, faith, and deliberate distance from constant exposure, and even her occasional returns to acting demonstrated that she never rejected the craft itself, only the cost of perpetual visibility. And in later years, her reflections on past experiences were measured and calm, focused on closure rather than accusation, and her story offers an alternative model of resilience, one that values restraint over reinvention and boundaries over relevance, suggesting that survival does not always require staying seen, but staying aligned with what sustains inner balance. Endurance as identity. The death of Michael Sloan in 2025 completed a long arc of loss that had begun in childhood, yet even in widowhood, Melissa's response followed a familiar pattern. Quiet endurance grounded in faith and routine, and her life, shaped by attachment and loss, does not resolve into spectacle or disappearance, but into steadiness, a continuation rather than an ending, and in that continuity lies its meaning, a reminder that strength can exist without performance, that fulfillment can be private, and that sometimes the most enduring stories are the ones lived quietly, carried forward not by applause, but by the simple determination to remain whole in a life shaped by change.